Hey guys, I'm James from Midwest Protocol, and today we're back at it with another 10 easy to miss rules for Marvel Crisis Protocol. This time, focusing on an affiliation, specifically the Avengers. Let's dive in. Rule number 1. Captain America Steve Rogers' leadership, a day unlike any other. So this is one of the very first leaderships to the game Marvel Crisis Protocol of the entirety of the game. And at face value, this leadership is pretty straightforward. You reduce the cost of your first superpower used by each ally each turn by 1 to a minimum of 1. But if you want to make the most use out of this leadership, there's just a few things to note. First off, you can always use this leadership on your opponent's turn because that is considered a different turn. And so whenever your opponent is activating and doing their shenanigans, hey, you get to utilize Steve's leadership then. Also, this has to be used on your first superpower, no matter what. So even if you can't reduce the cost where it's at the minimum cost, no matter what, you have to be able to potentially apply a day unlike any other to that superpower. So you might miss out on taking advantage of that leadership. So just choose your order of operations wisely. And finally, don't forget you can't use this leadership during the power or cleanup phases. Since if a superpower is limited to a turn, it can only occur during the activation phase. Rule number 2, Sam Wilson, Captain America, and his leadership, all new, all different. So Sam has a wonderful leadership to help at tempo, healing, and overall just great things for your team, but 2 things to note here. Don't forget, this has been errated and updated on the AMG website to be worded slightly differently than what was printed on the card. It mainly introduces a few words related to grunts, and also after the effect is resolved has been added as well. The addition of the after effect is resolved is pretty key though, and it helps you be able to know when to time it and when it should be occurring in the overall turn process. Also, this leadership only triggers off of enemy effects. So if you daze to cube damage or some other crisis effect, the leadership won't happen whatsoever. So only enemy effects is when this leadership will happen. And the timing of this leadership is easy to get wrong, so let me kind of break it down for you of what it would be like so that you have a general idea of how to utilize Sam's leadership. So say a character like Cyclops fires off his optic blast into maybe Ant-Man. And so he dazes Ant-Man while also landing the speed of sight trigger for optic blast, which means he can make a second optic blast attack. Speed of sight allows Cyclops to make that attack into a character other than the original target. And so since Ant-Man is dazed, Sam's leadership triggers. So when does the leadership occur though? Is it before the second attack from Cyclops or after? And if you said after, well, you would be right. Since both have the after the effect is resolved conditions, the attacker goes first. So it's always going to be attacker, then defender in that order. And finally, once that entire attack sequence is over, the Avengers player may then use Sam's leadership to move a character, remove a special condition, and remove a wound. The same sequence occurs for beams and area of effect attacks. However, Sam's leadership occurs before each attack, since beams and area of effects are each individual attacks. So if you're beaming 3 different people, after each specific attack, you'll be able to use Sam's leadership. Same with area of effect. Rule number 3, Hulk being dazed. So when the big mean green guy finally takes 20 wounds and is killed off the board, how often, if you're like me, do you just grab Hulk and take him off the table in anger and frustration and ultimate sadness? Well, if so, then you're playing it wrong, and Hulk's innate superpower, "You won't like me when I'm angry," has the important text about increasing attack dice based on his total number of wounds, but sometimes you might forget about the latter part of that superpower. It states that when Hulk would flip to its injured side, instead, he's KO'd. So remember, the flip happens during the cleanup phase, so when you daze a Hulk or your Hulk is dazed, just keep him on the board until the cleanup phase, which can be important for body blocking or any other effect that may want a 65mm big old boy base in the middle of the board. Another side note that you might not be aware of is that dazed characters still interact with the game state in various ways. Some leaderships or team tactics cards can take advantage of them on the board, but they are also a viable target for throwing characters with them. They don't receive damage, but the thrown character still will take a single wound. So just something to be aware of. Rule number 4, transform. Ant-Man and the Wasp can only transform once per turn, since their transform superpower is the same power in both forms. Another thing to note about their superpower, PIM particle control, even though they may transform and be placed within range 1 of their current position in their new form, they don't avoid being attacked by the triggering attack. For example, we go back to Cyclops decides to throw his Optic Devastation beam into Ant-Man and Hulk, and Ant-Man then maybe decides to use Pym Particle Control once he's been targeted, because his condition to be able to use that ability is when he is targeted. And then he transforms into his tiny form and effectively moves himself out of the beam tool, because when you're transformed, you can be placed within range 1 of your current position, right? So maybe you move outside of where the beam would be laid. Well, at first thought, you might be inclined to think that Ant-Man is no longer targetable. However, the targeting step occurs during 2A of the attack sequence. And I know that's a little nuanced, but it's important to note that. So when you are targeted, you are locked in, essentially. And while Ant-Man's transform occurs at 2D of the attack sequence, it means that no matter where he goes, he will still be targeted by Optic Devastation. It's important to note that because that can be easily confused. It's confused me in the past for sure. This can, however, allow Ant-Man to transform and move into cover for defensive purposes. But the easy thing to remember is that unless a superpower or attack or a Team Tactics card or something says to recheck range or line of sight, or both, once a character has been targeted, it's pretty much locked in. Rule number 5, binary and morphogenetics. So when Captain America, or Carol Danvers, the original one, uses their superpower binary form, they add a token to their character, which increases their attack and defense dice until the start of their next activation. The token is just there for visual purposes, but essentially they are binary until the start of their next turn, where they are stronger and more defensive, right? However, what happens when Captain Marvel is dazed before their next activation? Well, Captain Marvel then stays binary. And that's because dazed characters cannot be affected by special rules. And there's nothing on her card that says to remove the binary token when she is dazed, or any sort of language that says otherwise. So because of that, when Captain Marvel is dazed and in binary form, they will flip their card, stay binary, and then until they activate again, they are binary, effectively getting the 2 extra defense dice up until you decide to activate them on the next turn. Another thing to note is that Miss Marvel has a similar effect with Morphogenetics, but much harder to get past, a little bit more nuanced. And Morphogenetics states that Miss Marvel must transform back to her normal form at the end of her activation. So imagine Miss Marvel attacks into maybe Bullseye, who then uses Parting Shot to inflict a wound into Miss Marvel, dazing her and advancing away short. And so maybe during this entire interaction, Miss Marvel has been embiggened that entire time, so she got dazed because of Bullseye on her own turn. And so since it was during her activation, and she never reached the end of it, she will stay embiggened until the end of her next activation. It's a cool trick, but very, very hard to trigger. Rule number 6, Helios Laser Bombardment, one of the greatest cards in Marvel Crisis Protocol, in my opinion, and it's just a ton of fun throwing a ton of dice at one big character. And Tony Stark is the one to take advantage of that, but even though you may be playing it in your Avengers list, you may not be aware of some interactions that will completely shut down the card, because at first glance, it seems like this card is pretty amazing and there's no way to get by it because it ignores line of sight, ignores cover, it's range 5. Oh boy, it's gonna get nuts. However, there are a few things to be aware of so that you can be on the defensive when you're using Helios. Also, if you're watching this and someone is using Helios against you, hey, this is one way to stop it. So imagine this insane nightmare scenario. Let's lay it down for you, right? You decide to Helios a Hulk, maybe throwing 15 to 20 power from your entire team into the attack, draining your entire roster with the hopes of taking out the big green boy, right? Little do you know, maybe, or realize that Gwen Stacy, Ghost Spider, is just hanging out in the corner, just sitting off and ready to help out Bruce. After you target Hulk, your opponent then decides to use Lifesaver from Ghost Spider to pull Hulk towards her, effectively moving his base outside of range 5 of Helios. And per Lifesaver, Iron Man then has to check the range and line of sight again, and Hulk, lo and behold, is outside of range 5. Unfortunately, Iron Man does get his attack back, but unfortunately does not get the power that he spent back. Womp, womp, womp. So if you're running Helios, be aware of Lifesaver or any other sort of attack that makes you recheck line of sight and range, because these are some ways to really shut it down, and also it makes for a great way to make a new best friend across the table. Rule number 7, Gwenpool's spender. So Gwendolyn Pool, or Gwenpool as we all know her, has a fun little spender this in toward the target, and for 4 power and range 4, she can throw 8 energy dice into a target, giving them incinerate and stun. It's great. It's a wonderful ability and has a ton of bang to it. She also, if she gets her wild trigger, she can deal 1 additional wound and pass out incinerate to all the characters within range 2 of the target as well. It's pretty nice, but don't let this get past you. It says all characters, which means she can damage her own friends, allies, and also, funnily enough, herself. And if Gwenpool herself is within range 2 of the target, she will get hit with the Scorched Earth effect herself. So just something to be aware of. Rule number 8, rogue agents. So characters with the rogue agent innate superpower are extremely useful in roster building and meeting your affiliation requirements. One commonly missed aspect of this superpower is that the character only counts toward the affiliated character count during squad building. So after you've built your squad, the rogue agent character is only affiliated with whichever affiliation they are innately included with. And so, like, you can look at the rogue agent superpower does not make a character that is only shield affiliated now Avengers for the game. In practice, it means that rogue agents cannot benefit from affiliated team tactics cards throughout the game. Also, something similar to note is that squad members are not inherently granted your squad's affiliation. So splash characters you bring into your Avengers affiliation will not be able to take advantage of Avengers Assemble or similarly worded cards. Rule number 9, may versus must. Words are important, and they could not be more important in Marvel Crisis Protocol. Let's take a look at a quick example of how that can apply. Both Iron Man and Invincible Iron Man have a push on their repulsor blast attacks that lack the may clause, meaning that if you roll the wild, you have to push the target if you can. You can't miss it. It has to occur no matter what. Similarly, Captain America Steve Rogers has a wild trigger for his push on his strike attack, but it has the word may included. This means it's the player's choice if they want to push the target or not. So a quick and easy word of advice is to just slow down, make sure to read your cards carefully, and everything in this game will come a lot more smoothly for you. And rule number 10, Ricochet triggers. Since the Avengers have the most shield-throwing characters in affiliation, I thought it would be helpful to include a quick discussion on Ricochet triggers and how they work to demystify the nuances of the attacks and triggers themselves. So first off, let's talk about timing. The Ricochet is a trigger that occurs after the attack is resolved. So before the defender can maybe slippery away or use parting shot into you in response, you're able to perform your second attack. Secondly, Ricochet's range is measured from the original target's base, which is pretty awesome. And that means that it further extends how far your shield throw can reach. Thirdly, Ricochet does not ignore stealth, even though the range is measured from the original target. The attacker still must be within range 3 of characters with stealth. That's because stealth specifically states characters must be within range 3 to target this character with attacks. And then finally, Ricochet does not trigger off of a KO'd model. Don't ask me how I know that, but I may have some experience with that. And so if your initial shield throw goes off and KOs a model off the board and also hits the trigger, unfortunately, you won't be able to continue the onslaught. It's over right there. That's it, guys. 10 easy to miss rules for Marvel Crisis Protocol with a focus on the Avengers Affiliation. Obviously, this is not exhaustive, but I try to include some of the most popular Avengers characters with missable rules that also wouldn't probably be found in a different affiliation video. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Also, I could not have compiled this list together without the amazing and fantastic help from the Atomic Mass Games forum, and cannot recommend using the forum more. It is a great resource for learning about some of the nuances of the game and kind of clarifying some of those rules that seem a little foggy at first glance. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking out their site. Lastly, thank you so much for sticking around, and hopefully you found this video to be helpful and informative. If you liked what you saw or you learned something from this video, it would be great if you could just maybe like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you have ideas on future videos or maybe other affiliations you want to see 10 easy rules to miss for, hey, this is great. Feel free to comment below, and I'll definitely be checking those out and be thinking about future content to be releasing. Well, that's it. I'm James with Midwest Protocol, And thanks again for hanging out. With that, it's now time to get back to gaming.